There was something about the silence of space that Martin Gibson hadn't expected. He had written about it countless times in his novels. Space, that vast black ocean scattered with stars, had always been alive in his imagination. But reality was different. Reality was quieter. He now sat by the viewing port of the Ares, staring into that unimaginable stillness, and felt smaller than he ever had before. Gibson wasn't a scientist, nor a soldier. He was a writer. A famous one, to be fair. His books had inspired generations to look up at the stars. But now, for the first time, he wasn't imagining them. He was sailing through them. Invited by Earth's Space Department to document the Martian colony for the people back home, he had thought the journey would be simple. Observe, write, return. But even in the first few days aboard the Ares, he realized this voyage would change far more than his next novel. It was beginning to change him. The Ares was no luxury cruiser. It was a vessel of precision, built for survival and efficiency, not comfort. The corridors were narrow, every surface either metallic or sealed plastic, and the constant hum of the ion engines served as a mechanical heartbeat. Life here was governed by protocols and checklists. No improvisation, no imagination. The contrast with Gibson's creative mind was jarring, but oddly, it fascinated him. Captain Norden, a tall man with quiet authority, welcomed Gibson with polite detachment. "We don't get many civilians," he had said, eyes measuring the writer like a loose bolt. "Least of all, storytellers." Still, he assigned a small cabin and made it clear. Gibson was free to observe, but he was not to interfere. The crew, efficient and focused, had little interest in Earth celebrities. They had jobs to do: navigation, systems checks, environmental monitoring. And yet, slowly, the ice began to melt. A shared joke over dehydrated coffee. A late-night chat in the observation lounge. Gibson found himself drawn to their quiet determination. They weren't adventurers in the romantic sense. They were builders, caretakers of something larger than themselves. As days turned to weeks, he began keeping a journal, not for publication, not yet, but to process what he was learning. He wrote of the psychological toll of space travel, the claustrophobia, the absence of night and day, the emotional flatness that sometimes crept in like a slow fog. He wrote of dreams haunted by stars that never moved. And he wrote of admiration for the crew, for the engineers who had built this ship, and for the colonists who had chosen Mars not as an escape, but as a home. He spent hours by the viewport, watching Mars grow from a distant ember to a discernible disk, then a world. Red, veined with canyons and shadowed craters, it hung in the void like a challenge. A question. Could humanity truly belong there? One evening, Captain Norden joined him in the lounge. They stood side by side in silence until the captain finally spoke. "She's not a friendly world," he said, gesturing to the planet ahead. "But she's honest. You either adapt or you die. Mars doesn't lie." Gibson turned to him. "And Earth does?" Norden didn't answer. He just walked away. That night, Gibson couldn't sleep. He thought of the people already living on Mars, pioneers carving out a life in red soil and thin air. Not soldiers, not tourists, just humans reaching past their limits. The romance of space had faded, but something greater had replaced it. Respect. By the time the Ares began its final descent, Gibson was no longer merely an observer. He had passed through something invisible. An internal threshold. He was still a writer, yes. And as the Martian surface rose to meet him, colored in ochres and rust and 100 silent mysteries, Martin Gibson whispered the only words that made sense. "This is where the real story begins." story begins. The Martian sky was not red. Not truly. It shimmered in shades of copper and faded apricot. A dusty light diffused through the thin atmosphere, too weak to cast proper shadows. Martin Gibson stood beneath it, boots firm in the ochre sand. And for the first time since leaving Earth, he understood what it meant to stand on another world. Port Lowell wasn't what he expected. It wasn't a shining dome or a glittering city under glass. It was practical, scarred, alive. Clusters of pressurized modules hunched close together like survivors huddling against the wind. Every surface was worn, patched, repurposed. Mars was not a land of luxury. It was a place of determination. Everything here had to earn its right to exist. Colonists moved with quiet efficiency. Engineers in stained suits carried equipment across the main square, if you could call it that. Children in thermal gear kicked a ball made from recycled fabric. Scientists discussed soil samples like they were sacred texts. Gibson, notebook in hand, drifted among them like a ghost from another world. Observing, listening, writing, he had expected hardship. His guide was Warren Hadfield, head of colonial administration. A lean man with a lined face and sunburnt eyes, Warren had the quiet steadiness of someone who had buried friends in Martian soil. "We don't have time for grand speeches," he said. "We work. We sleep. We try not to break anything, including ourselves." But beneath that stoic exterior lay pride. He took Gibson through every chamber of Port Lowell, the algae farms that fed the colony, the recycling units that turned waste into air and water, the control room with its blinking consoles tracking dust storms and radiation spikes. It was all so fragile, and yet so resilient. Life on Mars was not lived. Gibson found himself fascinated by the psychology of the colonists. These were not escapists or thrill-seekers. They were idealists, realists, scientists, people who had grown tired of Earth's noise and chaos. They spoke slowly, deliberately, conserving not just breath, but meaning. Their jokes were dry. Their hope was quiet. They had come here not to conquer, but to endure. He spoke with a botanist who had coaxed the first flowering plant to bloom in Martian soil. "It wasn't pretty," she said, "but it was alive. That's all that mattered." He watched a teacher explain Martian gravity to children born on this world. Children who would never know rain, who thought Earth was a storybook. He even met a musician who composed in silence, claiming Mars had its own rhythm, a cadence of wind, tension, and waiting. Deep beneath the colony, past airlocks and reinforced corridors, scientists were nurturing something extraordinary. A native Martian plant, not Earthborn, not imported, discovered in a cave deep beneath the southern highlands. "It photosynthesizes using infrared," the lead biologist whispered, as if afraid the walls might overhear. "It could change everything." The implications struck Gibson like lightning. Mars was not dead. It had life, primitive, silent, ancient. And if that were true, then humanity wasn't just building a home. They were guests, perhaps even intruders. He wrote that night with furious intensity, hands trembling. The colonists didn't know how the world would receive this news. Would Earth embrace the discovery, or would it fear it? Outside, a dust storm howled in the distance, its voice rattling the habitat walls like an ancient warning. Gibson stared into the dark, at a sky that held no stars through the red haze, and he understood. The frontier was not a place. It was a question. And Mars was still waiting for an answer. He thought of the children again, their laughter, their strange Martian accents, their bright drawings of a world they'd never seen. Earth was not their home. Mars was. And as he looked back at the colony, lights flickering against the gathering storm, Martin Gibson realized something he hadn't expected. He didn't want to leave. Not yet. It began with a rumor, a fragment of overheard speech, a locked door in the south wing. A geologist who, upon seeing Gibson approach, changed the subject mid-sentence and smiled too quickly. Something was being hidden, not from the public, but from Earth. Gibson had not come to Mars to expose secrets. He was a writer, not a spy, but Mars had a way of sharpening curiosity, and what he had seen, the native plant, the resilience of the colonists, the quiet nobility of this red world, it all suggested something deeper, something no one dared say aloud. Then Warren Hadfield summoned him. They met beneath the dome's eastern strut, where sunlight filtered through reinforced glass and fell in thin, amber beams. Warren was silent for a long time, gazing out at the endless rusted sands. "There's a place," he said finally, "about 200 kilometers from here, a formation we call the Fire Basin. No one's supposed to go there alone, not without clearance." Gibson frowned. "Why?" Warren didn't answer. He simply handed over a set of coordinates. "You want to understand Mars," he said. "Really understand it? Take a rover. Take 2 days. Then come back. If you still want to write your book the way you planned, I won't stop you." That night, Gibson left before dawn. The rover hummed across the plains like a ghost on wheels. Outside, the landscape shifted from dunes to jagged ridges, cracked salt beds, and fossilized lava flows. Mars was a place of silence and violence, both carved deep into its bones. For hours, there was nothing but wind, until the cliffs appeared. They rose like broken teeth from the planet's crust, framing a shallow depression of shimmering crimson dust. Fire Basin. He parked at the rim and stepped out, suit hissing as it equalized pressure. The silence was overwhelming, like standing in the pause before a whispered confession. Then he saw it. Half buried in the sand, like a secret the planet hadn't meant to share, was a structure. Not natural, not shaped by wind or ice. Smooth, metallic, angular, alien. It was the size of a house, shaped like a prism fractured at the edges, blackened by time but unmistakably artificial. Around it, the sand was scorched, as if long ago something had flared with impossible heat. Gibson's breath caught. This wasn't just life. This was intelligence. He approached slowly, his recorder humming. The surface of the structure pulsed faintly, like an ember still warm. There were no doors, no windows, but there were symbols, etched into the alloy, faintly glowing. Patterns that twisted his eyes when he stared too long. Not human, not earthborn. He reached out, hesitated, and touched the metal. Images flooded his mind. Not visions, impressions, feelings. A sense of motion without movement. Distance without direction. A voice without sound, asking no question, offering no comfort. Just a single overwhelming sensation. Watching. He stumbled back, gasping. Hours passed. He wasn't sure how many. The structure never moved. But he had changed. He could feel it. Something in his thoughts now vibrated with a frequency not his own. He returned to Port Lowell at dusk on the second day. Warren was waiting. He didn't ask what Gibson had seen. "You understand now," he said, "why we've told no one." "It's not just a plant," Gibson whispered. "Not just a new species. Mars isn't dead." "No," Warren said, "and it may never have been." They walked in silence to the observation deck. Above them, the Martian sky faded into violet dusk. Somewhere behind that horizon, buried in dust and silence, lay a monument not to humanity's future, but someone else's past. "If we tell Earth," Gibson asked, "what do you think they'll do?" Warren didn't hesitate. "They'll come, with flags and weapons, with scientists and CEOs. They'll want to own it, name it, dissect it. And if we stay silent, then we protect it. And maybe, just maybe, learn something greater than we ever found on Earth. They found him at dawn. A transmission from Earth had finally caught up to Port Lowell, and with it came the inevitable. An inquiry from the Directorate. Not a request, an order. A high-priority directive, tagged with 5 levels of clearance, and one chilling word: exposure. Someone had spoken. Gibson stared at the tablet in his hand. The message was clinical. It referenced satellite scans, anomalous magnetic fields, increased signal activity in Sector A9, the coordinates of the fire basin. They didn't ask what was there. They already knew. "I didn't send anything," he said to Warren. The governor looked tired. "You didn't have to. They've been watching every dust storm we kick up. We knew this wouldn't stay buried." Outside, the dome lights were dimming, transitioning to Martian daylight. Gibson could already see workers outside in exosuits, tending to solar arrays, oblivious to the storm coming from across the stars. "How long?" he asked. 3 weeks, maybe less. A survey ship's en route. Earthfleet, with science and security personnel. Officially, they're here to support colonial development. Gibson laughed, but there was no humor in it. "They'll tear it apart." Warren nodded. "Or worse, seal it off, turn it into another myth. Hide it from the public, even from Mars itself." That afternoon, Gibson walked the length of the habitat tunnels, his thoughts a blur. He passed families planting seedlings in Martian soil, children racing drones through the corridors, engineers laughing over broken oxygen filters. Life, real life, had finally begun on Mars. It was fragile, honest, precious, and about to be shattered. He made his choice that night. The message was short. Less than 2 minutes of footage. It showed the alien structure, the etched markings, and the basin lit by 2 moons. No commentary, no opinions, just one line of text overlaying the final image. "We are not alone, and we never were." He sent it not to Earth Command, not to any authority or agency. He sent it to the colonies, to the settlers of Europa's ocean rigs, to miners on Ganymede, to families living in orbit above Venus, to the people, not the powers. Within hours, it had gone viral. Mars was no longer just red dust and iron storms. It was history. Not human history, but something far older, and perhaps far wiser. And now the truth wasn't locked in a lab or buried beneath orders. It was everywhere. The Directorate's response came swift and loud. An emergency communication blackout was declared on Mars. Earthfleet's arrival was expedited. Warrants were issued. Warrants for Gibson. But it was too late. He and Warren stood atop Lowell Ridge as the first stars pierced the sky. Below, the domes of the colony shimmered with quiet purpose. "They'll strip your credentials," Warren said. "They'll exile you. Maybe worse." Gibson looked up at the stars. "Let them." A pause. "Why?" Warren asked. "Because the truth doesn't belong to governments," Gibson said. "It belongs to the people brave enough to live by it." In the days that followed, Mars became a question no one could ignore. Probes were redirected. Public debates raged on Earth. The fire basin was sealed, but every colonist knew what lay there. The silence was broken, and with it, the illusion that humanity was the first to walk among the stars. Gibson was never arrested. By the time Earthfleet arrived, he was gone. Some said he'd vanished into the desert, into the deep canyons where signals faded and winds howled for hours. Others said he had joined a rogue group of scientists determined to preserve the site from interference. No one knew for sure, but sometimes, late at night, new settlers would report a figure walking alone across the dunes, helmet off, head lifted to the sky, as if listening for something older than civilization itself. And deep in the fire basin, the alien structure still stood, untouched, waiting, not as a relic of the past, but as a beacon for the future.